Okay, good evening, everyone. So delighted to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining. This is the second in our series, the partnership with Harvard Hillel and B'nai Jeshurun, the Shemita Economy, Ancient Ideas Meet Modern Money. And we are delighted to present a very different sort of conversation than we had last for our first session. We're going to be exploring today the topic of Jewish wealth and philanthropy and the ways that we might think about that through the lenses of Shemita. And I'm Rabbi Shuli Passo. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at B'nai Jeshurun. Really pleased to be working with my brother, Rabbi Dani Passo, from Harvard Hillel to present this series. Really important and thought-provoking conversations. Before I introduce our presenters tonight, I just want to say that I think in money is always hard to talk about, or can be very hard to talk about. And I think particularly when we are talking about questions of wealth and philanthropy and who has money and who gets money and who gives money, the conversation may stir various things for you. I know that there are therapists who deal exclusively in helping people with their psychological money issues, because money brings up a lot of stuff for all of us in thinking about how we were raised and what it means to us and worth and self-worth. So all of that may come up this evening. And I think we also have different relationships, all of us who are on this call, and certainly all of us who are on this webinar tonight, on this as panelists, different relationships with money and with philanthropy, whether we've been the recipients of philanthropic endeavors or we have been on the giving end of philanthropic endeavors. And so we're really very, very excited. I'm very excited to be hearing from two amazing people who think about these questions and think about these issues from their own perspectives and experiences, which are quite different, but I think will be quite illuminating. So you may hear things tonight that resonate with your own experience or that feel very different from your own experience. That's okay. We're not here kind of presenting a one size fits all, this is how wealth and works for everyone in the Jewish community. But we think that the perspectives that our presenters will offer us tonight will be very enriching, pardon the pun, and hopefully thought-provoking as well, as we think about the relationship between money and power and its role in the Jewish community. So I'm really thrilled to introduce, you can read their full extensive bios on the website, but I want to get right into it. So we'll just say briefly to introduce Lila Corwin Berman, who holds the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History at Temple University. And her most recent book is The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution, which has won numerous awards and prizes. And she will offer us, I think, a very in-depth historical scholarly analysis. And Danielle Dirkslag is coming to us as an artist and filmmaker who's based in Brooklyn, but I think right now in California. And she's a wonderful artist whose work has been exhibited at the Jewish Museum, the Toronto Shorts International Film Festival, the UK Jewish Film Festival, and many other places. And as you'll hear, she has a very personal story and journey with philanthropy and the American Jewish community. So with that, I'm delighted again to welcome all of you. Thank you for being here. And I'm turning it over to Lila and Danielle to get us started.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start. Danielle and I have choreographed this to the minute, as I'm sure you'll see. I'm being a little facetious, but we're going to do this together and we're going to tag team a little bit. So first I want to start by thanking Shuli and Dani, and I have to mention your brother Nati too, because everything I learned about Shemita, I learned from Nati and then now from Shuli, and some wonderful materials, including a paper that you wrote about Shemita. And I think that for me and for Danielle, when we were talking about this, really the most bracing part about Shemita was how practical it is. And you know, we both listened to some teaching that Rabbi Shai Held did around Shemitah. And he talks so specifically about how Shemitah is driven by concrete solutions to really vexing social and economic questions. And like, in a sense, Shemitah, although it can be very metaphorical and you know, you can kind of get into the poetry perhaps of it, it's also really a blueprint. And it's a kind of app rendering maybe for this month when some of the most obsessive of us are starting to prepare for Passover, that Rabbi Held describes Shemitah as a guidebook for the anti-Egypt, for the way that we pass out of the narrow straits of oppression toward a kind of openness of freedom. And I was really thinking about this today when I was reflecting on Russia's aggression in Ukraine and how we release this world from the real narrows of overblown ideas of possession and who gets to possess what. So Danielle and I took really seriously the idea of exploring the very concrete and practical potential of Shemitah. And our goal was to ask, what could the practice offer for just 1 year to set right, or let's say more right, or set different the practices of Jewish wealth and philanthropy. And we drew really specific inspiration from a speech that an ethicist, a former dean of University of Chicago Divinity School named Lori Zoloth gave, in which she was talking about the radical practice of interruption. And in the context she was giving the speech, she was talking about climate change. But she has this amazing phrase that Shabbat, which is in so many different ways, from the kind of root of the word to the idea of seven, right, is analogous to Shemitah, that Shabbat means actively stopping as opposed to resting. So really what we're asking is, what should we actively stop, at least for a year, to reset the practices of Jewish wealth and philanthropy? So we're gonna kind of go back and forth a little bit. And the plan for tonight is I'm going to give some historical context and some reflection from my own research about the 4 things we're going to suggest. Like, these are, take them home with you, put them in your pocket. These are concrete things.
Yes.
And then Danielle is going to talk about her art and talk about herself and her own experience being really on the giving end of philanthropy. I have to say, I've been much more on the receiving end of philanthropy. So that's one way in which we come to this from different perspectives. And she's also going to share some short pieces of her art, of film, that really reflects on these themes. So that's our plan. And we're going to start with the first disruption. So we can move to that first.
Right. So this is our first disruption, which is a very concrete idea for Jewish philanthropy in the time of Shemitah, which is the idea of disrupting the 5% rule. For those who are watching, who might not be familiar with sort of the norms of philanthropy, the vast majority of giving sort of really gives 5% annually of what they could, which has a very kind of, thanks to Lila's incredible book, we now know a really confirmed history of how that happened. So Lila, can you start us off by talking about why 5%? Was it meant to eternally stay at 5% as the government mandate for the minimum you would give? And in your experience and in your research, are there a lot of organizations who give beyond this rule?
Right. So 5% rule was not anything I knew about before I started writing this book about philanthropy. And I became really interested in what were the kinds of structures and rules from the American state, right? From the kind of rules and regulations that delimited how philanthropy worked and how Jewish philanthropy worked. Because most of the stories I had heard were about, you know, really incredible organizations and sometimes about great leaders who were philanthropists. But I kind of wanted to understand, like, what structured the way this system worked. So one thing I started to learn about is that in the middle of the 20th century, Congress was starting to feel a lot of anxiety about private foundations, right? Specifically about, you know, individuals who had amassed a great deal of wealth and who had put an amount of that wealth in a trust or in some kind of foundation and said that at some point they would spend it. And this was in the 1950s. This was during McCarthyism. There's a lot of anxiety about the potential for sort of secret or subversive power. So Congress is really concerned about this, among other things. It's not its only concern. And a few different folks in the House of Representatives start investigating, right? And asking, well, how does private philanthropy work? And how do we know that it's operating in the public good, which was how it was being defined, right? And what resulted from those investigations was eventually a major tax reform act in 1969. Now, I promise you that tax legislation and tax law is the most interesting thing in the world. But in case you aren't going to share that conviction, and I can't convert you, I'll just tell you a tiny, tiny bit, which is this major cataclysmic, you think 1969, Woodstock, whatever, Tax Reform Act. What it did is it defined private foundations by law so that Congress could regulate them. And the idea really was to make sure that these private stores of money that were gaining tax benefit because there were exemptions and deductions were operating properly in the public good. And so things like having to report on what are now called 990 tax forms, what the expenditures were and how much the foundation had, all of that stuff starts to be instituted. And one of the really important things that Congress says is we can't let people have these tax benefits, which are meant to be a sign of public investment, and then have them just sit on their money. Like, that's not operating in the public good. So we should enforce some kind of percentage that they need to spend. And where they started was 5%. And always the idea was that percent would increase. The 5% was sort of a back of the napkin calculation. It was meant as a floor, not a ceiling. There was an expectation that a few years down the line, it would be 7 and then 8%, but it stuck. And it stuck to this very day. And this was just regulating private foundations, so like a family foundation. However, around the same time in the 70s and 80s, many institutions, endowments, were really growing at a rapid clip for all sorts of reasons. And interestingly, that same kind of mathematical principle that 5% was the right amount to spend from money that was being held in a charitable endowment, that came to govern how public institutions' endowments worked, right? So most colleges and universities today, for example, that hold endowments operate by the 5% rule.
That's right.
And the way that it now kind of exists in our world, it is as if it's ironclad, right? So that, when the pandemic started, the presidents from Harvard, from Yale, from Stanford, I read a few other letters, wrote these letters to people and said, we know that people are saying, look, you're sitting on tens of billions of dollars. Why not spend more? And let us just tell you, we have rules that govern our endowments, and we can't just spend more. Well, in fact, over the last year, 6 of the Ivies that have reported such things reported 42% growth in their endowments, right? So why 5% is the rule is there's a history, there were some calculations. It was never meant to be in perpetuity, the rule, but it's become this sense of what it means to be a responsible fiduciary agent. So our question was, what would it look like for a year to say, nah, spend more?
That's right.
7%, 8%, 18%.
Yeah, and this is like maybe a good moment to talk a little bit about my background that I come to this tonight from, which is that I make artwork about the American Jewish wealth, the psychological and sort of emotional and political complexities of that. And the reason why I feel the authority to do that is because that's the experience I come from, white Ashkenazi wealth. But my great-grandfather, who's the source of my financial luck, Nathan Cummings, because of nepotism and my luck in the birth lottery, not only did I get my own financial blessings, but also I served in one capacity or another for about 18 years at the Nathan Cummings Foundation on the giving side. So that's where I come to this conversation from. And just to kind of really support what Lila is saying, we had a lot of votes about times when people wanted, one or two people at the board, myself included, wanted to reopen the idea of spending more than 5%. And we never really did, very rarely. And the increments were small. I remember a big fight that I think landed in 5.35%. It's very endemic in philanthropy that people, generally you don't give more than 5. And we would love Shemita as kind of an opportunity to disrupt that. So Lila, I'm going to move on to a little bit of an intro to the piece I'm going to show, if that's okay.
Yes.
Danielle, actually, before you do that, I just want to jump in for 1 second and remind people, or tell people we have already a few questions in the Q&A. If you have a question at any point, you can put it in the Q&A. Please don't put it in anonymously, because what we're going to do with Q&A is when we get to the Q&A section, we're going to select people to actually come up, and we'll make you a panelist, and you'll be able to come on screen and unmute yourself and ask the question and engage with our panelists. So if you want to have your question answered, potentially we won't have time for all of them, but please don't put your question in anonymously, but you can put your questions in at any point, and we'll have Q&A at the end. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Shuli. So Nathan started out as my great-grandfather as a peddler selling shoes door to door. He was a Jewish immigrant, and by the end of his life, he's a philanthropic and business giant. That is the version of the Jewish 1% that I grew up in. And the series that I've been making for some years now, Bounty, is about the Jewish 1%. Specifically, the bulk of this series is something I call video collages. So my art practice is that I obsessively watch cinema from across the ages, and I look for cinematic stories of family wealth, which are almost never Jewish stories in the history of cinema, despite the incredible prevalence of Jews in that industry. And I use animation and editing and voice performers to transform this original film content, these original films, into true stories of the Jewish 1%. So tonight I'm going to start off by showing a film called Moser's Honor. This uses footage from a bunch of films, but predominantly from a film called Prizzi's Honor, which was made in the 1980s, an Italian-American mob movie. And before I show it, this is my mega donor piece. We'll talk a little bit after about the phenomenon of mega donors and how that sort of connects to the 5% rule and why it could use some disruption. But before I show it, I just want to quickly give a sense of the kinds of changes I'm making when I'm finding these films that I want to play with and remake as Jewish wealth stories. If you look at this, the upper image here, the northern end, this is an original still from Prizzi's Honor. And you'll notice we're in a Christian scene here, right? There's a woman here who's wearing a cross. There are no yarmulkes. I've made a yellow arrow to point out that there's no yarmulke. And I'm going to transform this, which was originally a Catholic wedding scene, into a synagogue scene. So how am I going to do that? If you look on the bottom, you'll see that with a wonderful animator and incredible editor that I work with, they were able to add a yarmulke to the gentleman on the left and remove that cross on the right. Those are the kinds of changes that I make to make these convincing Jewish spaces. One more example before I play the film, you'll see here that this was like a Catholic kind of wedding hall in the original film. So in order to make it convincingly into a synagogue, I realized, perfect. This is the kind of gem I look for when I'm watching movies. When I saw that it had stained glass in the back and an American flag on the left, I thought, I know how to make that into a synagogue. All you need is an Israeli flag. That matches every flag setup of every shul I ever went to as a kid. So those are just a couple of the kinds of interventions you're going to see as we watch. This film is about 2 minutes long. None of my pieces are very long. And I just want to give a warning before I press play on the next slide that over Zoom, sometimes things can be a little shaky or have like weird little pauses. Hopefully that won't happen, but I hope you'll bear with me. If it does, it's just the nature of the Zoom beast. So Moser's Honor, again, is the name of this piece. We will watch, and then we'll discuss a little bit.
And so the good people of Congregation Beth Anshe Elohim Etz Chaim Shalom arrived, once again, for Yom Kippur services. Sid Moser, Beth Anshe's most prominent member and feared benefactor, sat, as always, in the front row, gently snoring through the proceedings.
For the sin we have committed by immorality, and for the sin we have committed by stubbornness.
One of the first Jewish executives at Halliburton, Sid was known for his vitriolic hatred of socialism and being roused from sleep. The sole funder of the shul's Hebrew school and mikveh, Sid's generosity was honored every Yom Kippur by receiving the service's most prestigious aliyah. As this year's aliyah drew near, congregates began to whisper about Sid's continued slumber, concerned he might miss his invitation to approach the Torah. What was worse, they anxiously asked one another, to invoke Sid's wrath, their most important funder, by waking him, or to tempt Hashem's rage by letting the aliyah go unheeded on this holiest of days. Unless Sid woke very soon, they would be forced to choose.
Yamod, 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 Sid ben Avraham Shlishi.
That's it. So Lila, can you talk a little bit, if you would, about sort of the phenomenon of the megadonor and how and if that relates to the 5%? I realize we didn't do that before I showed the film.
No, I mean, this really kind of illustrates something of it. It's not that the 5% rule necessarily is the engine that creates, very, very wealthy people or billionaires. There's lots of other reasons that that kind of inequality exists in our society now, and that would be a different kind of discussion. But however, the 5% rule enables money that's kept in private foundations or endowments to continue on a trajectory of growth, right?
That's right.
And obviously the market can disrupt it, other things can disrupt it, inflation can sometimes disrupt it, but the way that the rule is framed and its incredible conservatism, right, is really meant to then hold on to capital and keep it and stick it, right, in certain places, sort of calcify it. And what that allows for is for the kind of, it's almost empire-like, right? The building of these mega donors who, no matter what they might be giving and the kind of power they might be amassing because they're giving, they're also constantly growing their philanthropic wealth. And so it makes it very, very difficult to sort of get out of that system.
That's right. And, there are many reasons that I made this piece, but one of them is, I'm really interested in sort of the phenomenon of the mega donor. My great-grandfather in his time was a kind of mega donor, and I consider it still, in 2022, a very gendered role. When we think of mega donors in Jewish life, they tend to be men. This character, Sid Moser, in this piece is really the only male protagonist in the whole series. There are many video pieces that make up Bounty, but I knew it had to be a man because the dynamics, particularly in religious life, around these sort of central philanthropic figures who wield so much power and can potentially cause so much concern and fear, so much so that you might skip an aliyah to not wake one, a very a non-traditional Jewish idea, especially at Yom Kippur. That dynamic is real and it is gendered. We're going to talk more about the dynamics of gender in Jewish wealth and philanthropy as we go, but I just wanted to point it out because the level of fear this congregation that I've made up holds for Sid Moser is not that outlandish in my experience in the kinds of machinations and movements that people will make to please the most important philanthropist in the room. That's a very real dynamic.
Right. Please, and sometimes also to protect that person's capital. Some of us may have read, ripped from the headlines about this major Russian Jewish donor who's given a lot of money to Yad Vashem, but who, under most kind of normal interpretation, should be the subject of some of the economic sanctions. And Yad Vashem is making a plea not to put those sanctions on him. So the way in which the kind of reproduction of power, right, the more power begetting more power dynamic, and then, certainly a gendered element too of that kind of, fear of a certain masculine power. I think, I think all of those forces are quite present.
That's right. That's exactly right. Which is why, in part, all these reasons support our sort of Shemita proposal, our first one, right? Like, what would it mean to give 10%, 15% for
18%.
18, 36, let's go to town. I think it's a really concrete way to chip away, if nothing else, at sort of the fantasy that these rules always have been and cannot be changed, right? So thank you all for watching. We're going to move on to our Shemita proposal number 2, which is about disrupting the secrecy of philanthropy. I will say from my own experience on the giving side, it's a very opaque world. It's hard to get in. I got in through birth luck, right? Something you can get in through other means, but this is a really closed world. And Lila, I feel like you understand that in a way that's totally different from me. I understood it because I was inside of those sort of private meetings, but you understand it because of your work. And I hope you would sort of talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So when I was talking about that 1969 Tax Reform Act that clearly I'm obsessed with, one of the pieces of it was, in fact, to mandate transparency, right? There was fear of the secrecy, a sense that that kind of secrecy could actually be really disruptive of democracy. And that was something that was really foremost on the minds of Congress. But what's interesting, very similar to the 5% rule, is that the mandates for transparency became, in a sense, very mechanistic. And instead of being an invitation to kind of in a full-throated way say, okay, we understand the value of this, it really became about just meeting the letter of the law. And so there is reporting that all philanthropic endeavors have to go through, but there are so many ways in which that reporting in many, in a sense, occludes more than it actually illuminates. And I wanted to talk about one experience I had that really kind of brought this home to me. So when I was doing the research on my book, I was not having a hard time getting lots of documents and archival things about big mainstays of Jewish philanthropy. But I knew, especially as I moved into the second half of the 20th century, that I really needed to study private Jewish family foundations. These became first rivaling powers to federations and the sort of public Jewish charitable structures. And eventually, in many ways, they sort of eclipsed them. So I started to poke around and see what I could find. And I found mainly closed doors. People who run those foundations would have phone calls with me, but when I asked to see documents, I was told, often very kindly, that no, we don't really have archives, or we don't invite researchers in to see that. So finally, I found that the Crown Foundation, which is a Chicago foundation, had on its staff a dedicated archivist. And I was like head over heels, so excited. I got his phone number. I called him. I had this like little fantasy that he's in this, room with just dusty papers crumbling all over, and his phone rings, right? And it's a rotary dial phone, and he picks it up, and he's been waiting, and here's the story, So I had this.
You finally showed up for him, Lila.
That's right. I showed up for him, and he was really excited. And I told him, and he said, "Oh yeah, we have all that stuff, but I need to talk to the family and make sure," because really his role was mainly to be a resource to the family. This is a foundation that started in 1947 and has gone through lots of generational change. And mainly, I think, when they have questions about things they've done in the past, he's the one who goes through the records and finds it. But he went dutifully and he asked the family, "Can I share this?" And I had told him the kinds of materials I was interested in. And he got a positive answer. So I was thrilled. Well, his answer was positive, but it had a little caveat, which is any piece of financial data had to be redacted. So this poor archivist, right, who I thought I'd made his day or his life by calling him, I probably really ruined a lot of his days, because he had to literally go through and redact all of the financial information. Now, I felt I was still able to actually glean a fair amount from this, but what a really incredible illustration of the value that many private family foundations place on secrecy. And it is not because Crown is nefarious or hiding something or any worse than anyone else, but it's in part this sense of the practices, of the rules, of the norms. And Shmita, this time of release, of active stopping, Danielle and I thought could invite an opportunity to say, we're not going to do this secretive thing anymore.
Yeah, what would it feel like? What would happen if a lot of these sort of cultural norms, I think that's a great way to put it, were inverted during Shemitah? And people said, these private family foundations said, anyone can come look at our stuff. And maybe even anyone can come observe a meeting, right? Think about how that would change the dynamics for both the givers and the receivers if these were much more public endeavors. It's a very concrete way to sort of live Shemitah potentially in a Jewish philanthropic context. I also just want to speak for a moment, Lila, coming from the experience of American Jewish wealth, to the fact that this practice also matches, in my experience, the culture of Ashkenazi wealth in this country, frankly, which is wanting a certain level of publicness, but being very private about any financial details. I think these two kind of feed each other, if that makes sense.
Danielle, I remember when we met, you told me a story about being with your father, I think, and asking him if you were wealthy. You were a kid?
Yes,
Right?
Right. We were walking together in a parking garage. I think I was about 5 or 6. And I asked, are we rich? I wanted to know. And he gave the answer that almost every wealthy parent I know has ever given, which is that first there's a pained silence. Very unusual in my family, but there it was, a pained silence after I asked that question. And then he said, we're comfortable. And after he stopped saying that, he unlocked his burgundy Jaguar and we both got inside. So it's a great example, right, of the kind of lengths even internally these families go to really make the details of the narrative opaque, sometimes even to each other, right? And we can see that made almost tangible, visible in these documents, which I've said to you before, Lila, I always feel like I'm looking at a CIA document when I look at these, right? That's what we associate with this kind of blacking out of information.
Right, and it's so interesting because what is being hidden sometimes is not even, objectively anything that needs to be hidden.
That's
like sometimes, right, it becomes about that kind of act of the privacy, of the protection, of the fear, right? These were documents from the 40s and 50s, right?
What were they going to tell you?
What were they going to, so
no, it's cultural as much as anything. But again, like the 5% rule that we were talking about before, this is not something that can't change. This was not set in stone for all time evermore. This is something that a private philanthropy really could play with through a Shemita lens, really becoming more transparent to the betterment, I strongly suspect, of the whole sector. So I hope that gives another idea for people who are watching. We're trying to give you these tangible sort of Shemita proposals. And if it's okay with you, Lila, I'm going to move on to our next proposal.
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. So number 3, this one is really close to my heart, everybody. Disrupt identity funding. So by identity funding, we're really talking here about funding continuity at its core. And continuity, as I'm sure a lot of people know who are watching, is sort of the Jewish euphemism for trying to get more Jews to have sex with other Jews to make new Jews. It's the fear of extinction is at the center of so much Jewish life, and philanthropy is absolutely no exception. It wasn't until I read Lila's phenomenal book that I even understood for the first time that identity funding as the core of Jewish philanthropy is a somewhat recent phenomenon. Would you say that's fair, Lila?
Absolutely. It's not recent that Jews, like other groups, think about what the future is going to be and wanting to have some control and sense of the future.
Right.
But there is a very particular kind of tie-in with a sort of financial shift, a sort of shift of what scholars would call kind of political economy, and the particular kind of identity funding and continuity. And I do want to just remind folks who are on that you can put questions in the Q&A. And feel free to, identify yourself so that then you can be called on.
Yes.
So one of the kinds of shifts that I noticed in tracing 20th century American Jewish philanthropy was a shift from what I think of as kind of material need philanthropy to identity philanthropy. And the shift was explicit. Like, it wasn't even that I needed to do much interpretation to see it. But after World War II, and the different journals and in the different correspondence and meetings of Jewish philanthropic organizations, in a sense, there was almost a crisis of the fact that Jews were gaining a fair amount of socioeconomic abundance in that post-World War II period. And how were these organizations that were no longer really being called to provision for, lots and lots of new immigrants, were not being called even to provision for much of Jewry in Europe because it had been decimated, right? There was a call to give money to the new state of Israel, but that those kind of material need things were diminishing. And yet the sense that giving philanthropy was such a core way that American Jews identified as Jews and also as Americans.
Right.
And there are discussions about now is the time to turn to, and often the language they would use is cultural work and identity work. That these are this is a different stage, And it's not about provisioning for material needs. It's about something that's very different. And at the very same time, the logic of holding back capital in endowments and in funds that were not going to just be like a kind of revolving door spent immediately, that logic became all the more important. In fact, in the earlier part of the 20th century, many Jewish federations had bylaws against holding on to money like that. They said money in, money out, right?
Wow.
We have needs that we need to provision for. So the idea, though, that the money itself could exist in perpetuity and that language starts to be used, coming right at the time when, a third of global Jews had been murdered.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. That's
right. And the idea of the money, the finance being something that could be there in perpetuity, and then the growing language of first survival and then continuity really sewed this kind of psychological piece together with this financial logic.
That's right. And Lila, we talked a fair amount over the years about, how fear and victimhood identities are so well earned in Jewish life by our history, often by our present, but also, even though it's understandable that continuity becomes kind of a Jewish obsession, because we both have a lot of compassion and understanding for those fears, that kind of existential anxiety, it's so well earned, it has gender implications that are really unfortunate here, right? Continuity, that narrative at its core, basically is pressuring Jewish women to make more Jews with our bodies. That's the fundamental sort of central idea of it. I would say it's a narrative that is heavily funded and sort of surmised by the men in our community, not shockingly. And, as I've said to you many times, Lila, any narrative that reduces the female sort of, I would say, contributions to Jewish life, to our ovarian output, I think really has to go, even though it has a very understandable kind of emotional base. So our very concrete proposal here, because just to say, identity funding is really at the center of so much Jewish funding. Would you say it's fair to say it's the central sort of funding approach, Lila?
It may not be where the most dollars go, but it's where the most rhetorical energy goes.
Yes,
absolutely.
That is absolutely correct. So our very concrete proposal to approach, Shemita from a philanthropic kind of space is, how about for 1 year, all of these Jewish philanthropies that are obsessing over continuity and identity and Jewish women having 3 babies and how to, spend money on kids who could already afford to go to Israel to make sure they go there because they might meet someone they like and they might have a baby. Instead of doing that, we're proposing that for a year, we leave the ovaries alone and really find out philanthropically what fills that space when you put that existential fear to the side. What meaning making actually fills that space philanthropically? I don't know the answer to that because it's been such a central discourse in Jewish life, but I'd love to find out, both for gender reasons and also because, fear, even though it's at the core of our community and we come by it so honestly, I think a lot of people would agree it's not the healthiest sort of resting place for making decisions that impact the whole tribe. So that is our very sort of concrete proposal. And now I'm going to show my second of 3 video pieces of the night. This is my sort of take on continuity. These 2 images are an example, again, of how I'm changing things here. So the footage that I'm using for this next piece is from a film called The Man Who Knew Too Much. It's a classic Hitchcock film starring Jimmy Stewart from the 1950s. I'm sure some of you have seen it. And on the left, you can see a billboard from the original film that is sort of proclaiming this symphony performance in London at the Royal Albert Hall. And at the right, you can see my changes to that billboard by employing animation. So it goes from the London Symphony Orchestra to the Never Again Orchestra. You can see there I'm sort of winking at the obsession around the Shoah in Jewish philanthropic life. And very importantly, right, this performance is made possible, if you can read with me on the right, with the generous support of the More Jewish Babies Foundation. Partly why I made this piece, and you'll see my version, which is called The Woman Who Heard Too Much, instead of being about an almost murder at a symphony, is about a Jewish mom who was overwrought at a performance of a very familiar show that I think a lot of you will recognize. My version is about continuity, it's about the gender implications of that narrative, but it's also about how funding continuity really limits Jewish cultural output. You know, when we're obsessed with making more Jews, we tend to want to fund things that are basically exclusively positive about us, whether it's about our victimhood or promotional content about us, which as a Jewish artist today, I find very limiting. I know a lot of artists do. So this is my commentary on all of that. I'm going to play it and then we'll keep going. Sound good, Lila? Are you with me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Great. Sorry, I muted.
No worries. Okay, I'll play. Here we go. This one's also about 2 minutes long.
Tradition.
Okay, there it is. If nothing else in this life, Lila, I have made Doris Day into a Jewish film performer, and I'm proud of that. So that's my take on continuity and sort of a lot of the reasons why we think that's worth a Shemita pause. Lila, can you talk a little bit about what we're looking at here? Because this is a more contemporary example of how these dynamics play out.
Yeah, and I am just mindful of time, so I want to make sure we get to see the last piece.
Yes.
But let me just say very briefly that one of the things I became interested in as I was finishing the book was this, actually, I think it just started right as I was done with the book, something called the Jewish Future Pledge, which a few Jewish philanthropists started. And it was to get people, it continues to exist, to get people to sign a pledge to devote at least 50% of their charitable funds in their estates to, quote, the Jewish people and or the state of Israel. And I was listening to some people on a webinar, and this was right as pandemic was starting, talking about how important this was to them, and just hearing so much of their distrust, really, that their children who were set to inherit their wealth would do what they wanted with it. And one woman had this amazing thing that she said. She had signed it. She was very, very wealthy. She said, well, we made the money, and I'm going to tell my children, this is how you have to spend it. You don't have endless options. If you want to save the whales, save the Jewish whales. This moment of like continuity for the whales, right? But it also reminds me of Julius Rosenwald, who was a beginning of the 20th century important business person from Sears Roebuck, and he started the Rosenwald Foundation.
Yes.
And he felt very strongly that you spend that money, you do not hold it as a dead hand over the future. So again, this rule of continuity being guarded by perpetuity, it doesn't have to be a rule. You could disrupt it. You could release yourself from it.
Yeah, you can really support whales of all faiths if that
Indeed.
appeals to you. Yes. Because of time, I just want to move on to our final proposal here, Lila. This is disrupt the deciders. Now, I think we all have a pretty clear idea of who the deciders are in philanthropy. In private family foundations, there are sometimes staff, and I was very lucky to come from an experience that included staff. There often is not staff, but the deciders in the room are really the 1%ers, right? Who are there either because they gave the money originally or they are the descendants of the original givers. And can you just talk for a minute, Lila, about why we think that system of only the wealthy making the decisions at the table could use some disruption?
Well, I mean, here's one very basic thing, which is roughly 30% of philanthropic capital is fairly described, in my opinion, as public money.
Yes.
Because of the way that tax exemptions and deductions work. So does it make sense that these particular families or the boards get to make all the decisions, right? And furthermore, if they're designating the communities they're trying to help or what the problems are, what would it look like to actually have people who are part of those communities participate in spending the money that also is connected to those communities by dint of the fact that there's public money that is really invested in philanthropy, right? For like actual material money.
Yes, and I think, the Shemita sort of reading and watching that we were doing really supports this notion. I was very touched in some of the stuff that we were researching for this talk about the idea of Shemita as this idea to radically face those in your community who are in need as your brother. The word brother in Hebrew is used repeatedly in these Shemitah sort of moments. And what better way, right, to really embody that sort of Torah-led mandate to experience yourself as the giver and the one receiving as peers than have them make the decision with you. Maybe even have them make the decision instead of you, right? It's a way to really live that sort of Shemitah idea of we're actually brothers in this dynamic. It's not about someone superior and someone inferior. The opacity and the sort of closed offness of Jewish philanthropy, of all family philanthropy, frankly, really makes that dynamic quite different than the Torah's ideal, So this is the last film that I'm going to show tonight. It's a very quick one. It's just a minute. And probably why I wanted to show this one tonight, I'm showing the pieces in my Bounty series that relate to philanthropy for obvious reasons. This one is really about a kind of what I'd call a classic decider. The main character in this piece is a Jewish doyen in New York, and she's one of these women, I know several of them, maybe some of you do as well, who really puts on galas as sort of in place of where classic professional identity might go. Her professional identity is about putting on philanthropic evenings, right? And I just want to say before I show it, if we have a minute talk after, we will. If not, we can go to Q&A. But this piece is not only based on my personal experience of that sort of gala circuit, but it's also based on interviews with some of the doyens who do this in New York City. And I think this piece sort of illustrates why potentially opening up other deciders into the process might be beneficial. So if you're ready for me, guys, I'm going to play this, and this is the last one. Here we go. This is called Tzedakah.
Oh, God, that's Shira. I know it. I told Shira Hershkoff I would not be available again until this afternoon. Why do I always agree to host these benefits? Can these bitches on the committee do anything by themselves? I mean, anything. Oh my God, I look like my great-aunt Fromka. Oh, I wish I had time for a peel. Shira probably wants to brag about what a fabulous job she did on the flowers. But who got Ellie Wiesel to confirm for tonight? After he already RSVP'd to the leukemia gala the same evening. Who convinced him of the need for more Zionist voices in the raw food movement and secured his support? Me. Not that any of these toddlers would ever give me credit. It's going to be murder getting to the Rainbow Room at this hour. And I still have to approve the decorations. God, I hope Wiesel doesn't ditch us at the last minute for leukemia.
That is it. That's the last piece. I think partly, why I made this piece is because I've always been really fascinated by how little actual discussion in the world of sort of gala throwing and gala attending there tends to be of the actual charity, right? These functions are so much about society building, wealthy world building. And it's one of many reasons why I think having other deciders in the room could really shift focus and shift narrative in ways that might be beneficial, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And so different, I laughed sometimes when I did my work, but it's just like so ventilating to be able to talk about these things and also see some humor in it, and you're not poking fun at the other because you lived this. And so it's also, just has a certain kind of poignancy almost. So I know we were going to take some questions and answers, and maybe Danielle, you want to not share.
I'm gonna stop sharing.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle and Lila. I do feel like we could go on with this for many, many hours over the course of the evening. Pardon my family in the background there. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I actually did want to start with a question of my own, and going back to I think that was your third disruption around disrupting the identity funding, and I want to push back on that a little bit. As a woman, I guess as a rabbi, but even not in my professional capacity, but just thinking about on a very personal and professional level, I am very committed to Jewish continuity and securing the Jewish future. What I have personally felt kind of troubling or uncomfortable about the identity funding that, as you're describing it, is less the idea of continuity, but more about not interrogating the question of why people are not interested in being part of Jewish communities. Where have we not allowed for meaningful engagement with spirituality, with God, with community, with Jewish history, with learning? And so I guess it's more of a statement, but a little bit of a question. I'm curious to hear your responses to the idea of what if the disruption that you're talking about is less around the types of projects that are funded, but more of the framing and the language that's used, so that the narrative and the conversation gets pushed more to a question of how are we creating meaningful Jewish communities and spaces that people want to be part of, as opposed to language and framing that I agree with you feels a little bit kind of out of a place of fear, which again, not surprising. I have that in my own family history as a granddaughter of survivors. But I'm curious in your reactions to that. Is that, Lila, from your understanding and knowledge of foundations, is that something that a shift in narrative would be appealing, interesting to donors? And Danielle, clearly your work is coming from a very personal reaction to that identity funding. Like, well, how does that sound to you?
Do you mind, Lila, if I go for this one? Yeah,
No.
right first. Shuli, I'm going to actually push back on your pushback, and I'm going to say that by you being interested in Jewish meaning, you're not interested in continuity in its classical form. What I mean by that is there's a really big difference, I think, narratively between why isn't anyone coming? We want people to come, which is a very anxious, fear-centered sort of questioning, and letting go of the numbers altogether and saying, what's the most alive, meaningful version of Judaism we can create? I think when you make Judaism alive, dynamic, and resonant, people will show up. But when you focus on people showing up, it's actually terribly off-putting. For me, it's off-putting from a gender place, but I also think just energetically it's off-putting. We've all walked into a party where there aren't a lot of people there, and the host says, why isn't anyone here? I told people to come. And your first thought is, should I go? Right? Because it's an uncomfortable dynamic. I don't think institutional Jewish life has figured that out yet. So I would say, in terms of what you're asking, Shuli, if the focus was on meaning, then the continuity conversation is almost superfluous, because meaningful, alive, resonant spaces, people show up. But when we make it all about butts in the seats, I think we actually miss the meaning a lot of the time. That's my response.
I have things to say, but I also really want to hear from other folks. So I'm sure we'll get a chance to circle back to some of that.
So we have David Rosen with us. David is a Harvard alum and directs the CEO of the Hebrew Free Loan Society. David, it's really wonderful to see you, and you can go ahead and you can ask your question. Unmute yourself though.
Yep, unmuted. Okay, so thanks a lot. I'm really so excited to be here with these particular speakers and these particular institutions. They all mean a lot to me. So thank you. My question is about the 5% disruption. So most people will tell you that 5% is a figure that allows them to spend but not deplete the corpus of the foundation's assets, and that way they can keep doing their work forever and ever and ever. And I wanted to ask you to speak to this concept of forever and ever is the aim, and how that interacts maybe with Shemita and how Shemita might disrupt that, because I think it's very legitimate for people to say, if we spend more than 5 or 7%, we're going to spend ourselves out of existence. So how would you respond to that? Thank you.
So first I would say, do the math again, because it's actually been shown by various economists and whatever that that's not, I mean, I know it's not your math, right? It's the, so it's not even clear necessarily that the rule makes mathematical sense. And the father of our two resident rabbis here is a mathematician, could tell us exactly if that makes sense. But the more substantive question is exactly, I think, what we should be thinking about. Should the goal be that this particular institution, this particular family's wealth or institution's wealth should exist forever and ever? And I think that one danger of that is it ends up really kind of calcifying power, right? Keeping power only in particular places. And it's hard once you have the kind of idea of perpetuity as one of your goals. I think it becomes hard to take risks. And, one of the things when people say why foundations are so important in American society or in Jewish life, it's well, because they take risks. They're nimble and they try new things. And if you want to make good on that, I think you have to not kind of hold on to a very risk-averse perspective, a very conserving perspective of existing in perpetuity, right? So I know, for example, David, that some of your work is about lending money at very low or no interest rates. And that's risk, right? That is risk, because you might not get it back, and who knows what's going to happen, what money you could have made if you didn't lend the money and whatever else. And part of that is saying, we're not just trying to conserve what we have for the future, right? We actually see that the future could be something totally different. If I lend this money to this family, maybe someone in that family is going to create something totally new that changes our future, right? So for all sorts of reasons, I think that there's something that's, almost stifling about that kind of impulse, that this has to exist forever because I have to keep doing the things that won't get done if I'm not here.
If it's okay, I have a quick addition, which is that having come from the giving side, which I'm no longer active in and I haven't been for a while, one of the things I noticed about the perpetuity construct is that it shifts the sort of narrative the family has a little bit away from the giving and more toward the family's future. So the conversation that I heard over and over again, well, we have to be in perpetuity, not only because we're going to give continually, and we're obviously very qualified to do that, et cetera, all those kind of, ego-centered sort of statements, but also people would say, well, I can't have my grandkids not have the opportunity to give away money after I've had it. I think that's a really dangerous distortion of why we're in the room. And it's a distortion I heard many, many times with many families, right? That perpetuity, yeah, the public statement is about a potential future giving. Sometimes the public statement is about, well, when it really starts pouring outside, when there's a really rainy day, we'll have these resources to give. The data shows us that doesn't happen. They don't give more when real tragedies happen in general. But also I think for these families, it not only codifies and sort of maintains the family power, because philanthropy is as much about family power as anything, but it also really makes the focus about the family's experience, which I think is ethically inappropriate.
David, thank you so much for joining and for that question. I think we'll take one final question here from Colin, who's a member of BJ. Colin, if you're able to turn on your camera and unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Happy to. Hi, Danielle, and hi, Lila. It's been wonderful to listen to you both together tonight.
Thank you.
So I had a question. In a lot of the DEI conversations recently, there's a lot of discussion about shared leadership as a new way forward in terms of nonprofit institutional leadership and corporate leadership. And I'm curious if either of you have thought about the intersection of that with this question of how Shemita might distribute power, wealth, and all of that.
That is a great question. And one of the literatures that I got pretty interested in had to do with participatory grant making, which is something the Ford Foundation worked on quite a bit. And it was exactly this idea, why is it that because we happen to have the wealth that we're necessarily the ones who should be solving the problems, especially when these are problems that are identified with particular communities, right? So whether it is communities that are, in underserved areas, or whether it's, a particular identity community. And so there's kind of a spectrum of ways that participatory grant making can work. So sometimes it's very I think about PJ Library, for example. They do a little bit of participatory grant making, maybe where, families might be able to say the books they liked more, or they didn't like, or things like that. It can be very low key. It can be also radical, where you say to the community, we know that you're the community that we want to give resources to, and you're the board now, and you decide what to do with it. There are sometimes ways in which this kind of practice of disruption can challenge certain kinds of ideas about expertise. And I think that, there are different kinds of studies where people ask, is it necessarily the case that giving all control to a particular community is going to solve problems in the best ways? And that, and that's a kind of issue of some tension and need to kind of work out, just like kind of in any democratic process, right? It turns out that pure radical democracy doesn't always come out with the best solutions. But I think that especially in terms of, and this maybe circles back to Shuli's question actually, because part of my issue with continuity is it doesn't mean continuity of the whole community as it exists, right? It just doesn't. It means continuity of a very particular ideal of what the real community is. And that's been historically the case. Now, that can shift. And it can shift. One way it can shift, I think, is through ideas of a kind of radically participatory process, where no institution gets to draw the line of what would be a valuable future Jewish person. And I think that a shift, a Shemita kind of shift, could help that happen.
I also just want to say briefly that we're seeing so much exciting conversation recently about lack of representation for Jews of color, Mizrahi Jews. I think historically, predominantly Ashkenazi organizations, which is most of Jewish life, right, have sort of felt like, well, we're Jews, Jews are white, and so we're covered, basically. But it's entirely not true. There are so many communities of Jews of color and Mizrahi and Sephardic. I also think, it's a moment, even if you, for some reason, really are insistent that it's just Jews at the table, I think we have a lot of diversifying within our own ranks that we haven't yet done at the high institutional level.
I think, one of the things that I think is interesting is that when you put these big ideas out there, the people who have, what they hear is give it all away. You go from all to nothing, from black to white. And what we're really talking about is having the bravery to rebalance for the best outcomes. But that's not the headlines of any conversation. It's not the title of any book. It's not the first 5 minutes of any presentation. And so I think one of the challenges is most people don't stay to then get into the rest of the conversation, which is about the grade, the nuance, the muck, how the sausage is made, how the kosher kielbasa is made. And I think that's one of the challenges. And it's taken me a while in a lot of different DEI conversations to kind of find my space where I get that we're figuring it all out, but we have to accept the premise that what is now doesn't work anymore. And so like, how do we, and I'm, I don't know, but this is great. Thank you.
By the way,
Alan,
that's
thank
such
you.
a Shmita that is such a Shmita premise, right? Like these last 6 years, imperfect, now we're going to try something else. That's right.
Colin, thanks for joining us and for your question. That really is time for this evening. So I want to thank you both so much, to Lila and to Danielle, for your wonderful insight, and to my big sister, Shuli, for orchestrating this event. This was the third in our 3-part series on Shmita. We will be back.
This was the second. This was the
sorry.
second in our 3-part series.
The second of our 3-part series. We will be back with our third next Wednesday, March 9th at 7 p.m. for a session titled The Pursuit of Prosperity and Equity in America Today, with 2 outstanding scholars. One is Dana Cunningham, who is the Dean of Civic Life at Tufts University, and the other is Greg Mankiw, Harvard economist and former chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. But once again, I want to thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Lila, and wish a good evening to you and to one and all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.